All right. So welcome to the Thousand Ant podcast where we talk about indie game development. This is a kind of a new experiment, so we're just getting our legs under us. This is the second episode. My name is Matt Schell. I'm on Twitter as @MattMirrorfish. I got my handle there on the screen. And I'm joined by the excellent Matt Gambell. Hi.
Oh, you're so kind. Hi. How's it going?
The most excellent Matt Gambell. So,
well, I wouldn't say that, but you're welcome
modest.
to.
You're modest in English. For folks who don't know Matt and his work, a little bit of context. Matt is an indie game developer. From our personal history, we both used to work together at Unity, which is how we got to know one another. And he also runs the highly excellent Game Dev Guide YouTube channel that if you haven't checked out yet, I really recommend. And you have an indie game project that you're working on. You want to give us a little intro to that?
Yeah. So I'm working on a game called Living the Deal. I've actually been working on it since we met. Yeah, it's been a while, but I was working on it part-time back then, whereas now I'm way more focused on it full-time. So, that's the indie dev life. But so it's a business management role-playing game, and you have to rise from sort of a deadbeat and grow a trading empire whilst maintaining your own well-being in the process. And the sort of hook of the game is that we don't really have combat, but we have negotiation battles in order to secure deals. So it's a sort of turn-based role-playing game mechanic inside of the life sim sort of elements of the game. So yeah, it's got a little bit of, a little bit of The Sims, a little bit of Monopoly, a little bit of like Harvest Moon in there as well. So it's been a passion project for a while. And we're finally sort of getting some good rhythm on it now, and the end is in sight, which is nice because it has, like I said, I've been working on it since like 2016. So yeah, we sort of finished RPG Tycoon, which was my first game, and immediately started on this, and then started work at Unity and all these other things that I ended up doing. And so it's sort of been all over the place for a long time. So it's nice to sort of be closer to the end than we've ever been before, So
amazing. No, that's awesome, and I feel like there's maybe an interesting place for us to start talking there. I know one of the things that, you mentioned the fact that, you've been in production now for a good number of years, and I know that it's a marathon, right? It's not a
it's a marathon.
It's not an easy process in many different ways, and I know that's something that a lot of folks struggle with. How have you kind of managed to keep your focus, your motivation? Obviously, you're the kind of, well, maybe not obviously, the audience may not know, but you're the main developer, right? And the kind of motive force behind the game. How have you kind of managed to stay on track over the long development cycle?
Other people keeping me sane, I think. Is that like other people affirming that this is a good game and it's the right decision. That's definitely the biggest thing, because that constant sense of self-doubt. But at the same time, I have that experience of working on RPG Tycoon. And even before that, I was thinking about this earlier before coming on to this. And I think actually what it comes down to is my background is actually in film, and I studied filmmaking. I've directed 2 feature films actually, but one of them was in the middle of, when we were working together basically. So, but my first movie was at university before I started RPG Tycoon. And that was something that was a huge, to make a feature film is a huge undertaking with like basically no money. We had like no money, and it was through the help of some student, like other colleagues of mine at the time that, I think most people thought I was crazy because I was like, we're going to do a feature in like 3 weeks. But yeah, we managed to pull all that off. And I think it's just that sort of perseverance and not looking how far there is left to go, but looking how far you've come, and that was such a long process because I was editing it in my 3rd year as well. And we didn't release it until I graduated in 2014. And that's when I started working on RPG Tycoon at the same time. So I think it was like, that was a good practice process for dedication for those years. Even to some degree doing the university work, right? Of like nothing really paying off for a year. And so I owe it to that. And the RPG Tycoon thing, that was different though, because it was in early access and I was getting money while I was working on it and getting feedback from the users. And so this is very different because it's not an early access game. It's, we're not going to release this. We may do a sort of beta phase just to polish the edges off, but the game should be done when it's playable, you know, because of various reasons that I won't go into too much. But yeah, no, I think like that's the thing, is that previous experience and also just understanding that projects take a long, you know, like Rome isn't built in a day. It's that kind of thing, right?
Yeah,
Is that like I often consider game design to building a house. If it's like all of the problems you'll face when you're building a house are the exact same problems you face when you're sort of trying to develop and design an entire game. All of the things that can go wrong will go wrong, the decisions you need to make, and the sub-decisions you need to make from that when you're designing.
Yeah, no, I think those are really good points. And I think that having that experience of completed larger, longer scale projects, right? I think that a lot of folks, myself included, you know, struggle with there is the kind of mountain of work that you have to climb over, right? But there's also that kind of emotional component of being able to stay motivated, and especially if you're working by yourself. Mm-hmm. Now, you're not working by yourself on this, right? You have a small team with you working on it.
So, I wouldn't be where I am without the team. So I'm the key designer, I'm the programmer. So I make the game, right? But I don't make the game look good. I have an artist who does that. We've recently brought on another character artist to help out with that. And it's like just a case of contracting out the work that I don't have time to do, you know, and finding people that like the project or interested in the project. And so, most of the design, UI, and then core sort of gameplay systems and mechanics are mine. So I'm the one who has the most time spent in the game, I guess.
Right.
But the sort of other creative parts I tend to lease out. And I have a biz dev friend that I met a while ago that we sort of have aligned goals. And so he's helping just potential funding opportunities for the studio as a whole rather than just this game. But
cool. Yeah, I think that's interesting. And I know that that's a kind of a discussion I've had with a couple folks I know, and I think it's interesting from a business perspective, right? How do you structure a team that can go the long haul when you're self-funding or you're not, you know, there's not a huge publisher attached with a ton of funding, so I think that approach of saying, okay, you're the main developer, you're the one who's kind of carrying the torch and making a lot of those kind of key gameplay decisions, but then there are these other collaborators that are kind of coming in on a contract basis or contributing pieces and then moving in and out.
And I, I wouldn't even diminish their value at all, but the game wouldn't be anywhere near as good as it was. You know, like the reason, for instance, Wayne is an environment artist, and he designed the entire city based off of like a Unity asset store asset that I got when I was prototyping the game. We moved from 2D to 3D, and I was like, okay, I need to pull out a city map just to see what that would feel like and get that like feeling of whether moving to 3D would look good. I mean, it did eventually. I was like, this is going to be great. But then I was like, well, I'm not going to release a game with a Unity asset pack, because that was also around the time that the whole like asset flip thing was happening. I was like,
which is interesting. Actually, I'd like to talk about that. That's a good topic.
Yeah, we should come back to that.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I was looking around for somebody, and I can't remember. I think it was just Twitter that I found him, or through some other people. But I got in touch and I was like, look, I don't have a huge amount of money, but here's what we need to do, and can I hire you for a bit to work on that? And he came in and he kept the style pretty much exactly the same as the asset pack, but made it our own, so it was unique enough, and added all of our own sort of feelings to it, because we have different regions in the game, and so he color coded all the different regions.
Cool.
If you go to a certain part of the map, there's like a different color palette, and that's when I sort of started to learn more through what he was doing about fixed color palettes and all these things, and how he basically made a texture that was all of the colors that he was using. And all of the game now, even from my pieces of work that I've done since he's sort of taken, he did his work, and he's still interested in the game, but
he's not actively working
that process,
on it now.
right? Is that you don't actively have everyone working on it full time all the time, but
exactly. Which
I've taken his work.
I think that's a good lesson for folks who are new to focus on. Right. It's like you don't have to hire 5 people who are working 40 hours a week for 4 years, right?
No, not at all.
That's I think a good.
No, I will definitely come back to that. Let me just finish this thought. So he built this sort of color palette texture, and now in all of the work that I do, whether I'm doing some environment artwork myself or like some UI stuff or some skin tone thing, just when I'm messing with some of the art things in general, I use that. That's the point of reference. So like the game wouldn't look as good without that input, and like that's really the upside to the creative collaboration side, is that you end up just picking up skills like through symbiosis, through like being like, oh no, this is why this thing looks good. Okay, well if I apply that logic to this other stuff that I'm working on, then it will stay in, it's that sort of coherence. I think I spoke about it in my UI video that I did, and it was really that coherence is what make games look good. Like as long as you're sticking to a set of rules from a visual style standpoint.
Yeah.
People don't care about like whether they're low poly or whatever, as long as there's like these rules that you've established. And so, I picked a lot of that up through that process.
I think that's super, super interesting. I think that there's a whole lot of places we could take the conversation from there. But I think that point about this is something I've been thinking about, and actually just did a video for the 1000 Ant channel talking about the process of thinking through a look for a game and trying to develop a kind of a visual language, and that concept of coherence, I think is a really good one. And I think that in our space, in the indie game developer space, you see a lot of programmers who are kind of striking out on their own. And maybe they are trying to pull stuff from asset stores, or they're pulling in different artists. And I think that as a goal and as a kind of a North Star to try to move towards, right, of saying, okay, whether it's a color palette or a kind of set of visual themes, let's come together on one idea and then try to carry that forward, even if there are many different sources of visual contribution to the project. I think that's a really good kind of tip.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think, I've become very much an advocate of that cohesive style. It's just that there's a lot of simple things you can do to just aesthetically make something look better.
Yeah.
And it's not really that difficult to do. And really, just that especially, I get it if you're using asset store stuff and, you don't have the options to pull from everywhere. But then, this is going to sound bad. At the same time, should you really be releasing a game that's just made entirely of asset store work? Is it just like...
Okay, let's go. Let's talk about that, actually. I think that's an interesting topic.
Yeah. Well, I think there's nothing wrong with using stuff for prototyping, right? And I think that's really or I think the Blender Guru had a really good comment about this, is there's nothing wrong with using assets for like tertiary background things, right? It's stuff that's not really going to be a big key feature. And AAA are doing that all the time with outsource and mega scans and all these sort of things. Exactly. The problem I have with it is that you don't want your game to look like everybody else's game.
Right.
Because then, especially in this environment, right, you're doing yourself a disservice because you will look like an asset flip, right? Because people will just trace it back and they'll be like, look, this entire thing. So even if your game is the best thing in the world, the perceived quality of it goes down, right? And you want to do as much as you can to make your game stand out. Let's just say stand out. That's probably the best way to do it.
No, I totally agree with that. I think that's a really good point. I think that your point is really well taken, and especially, like you say, for kind of stuff that's supporting material. And obviously we're talking about visual assets in this context, right?
100%. Yeah, right. Nobody's going to know if you're building it. Yeah, I've got so many different asset store like tools and whatever, right? But,
so I think that's a separate topic. But I think there was an interesting discussion on Twitter. It was, I think, Krister Kaitila, who's part of the One Game a Month thing, and he's sort of active on Twitter. And he was talking about the assets from Cinti Studios, these kind of low poly characters, and how you see them appearing all over the place in all these different projects. And he was like, maybe we should start to refer to them as like actors that are appearing in different movies, or thinking about it that way, And I thought that was kind of funny. There was this moment where there was this kind of toxic spiral of people when that kind of term asset flip got coined, right? Where it was, Jim Sterling? Yeah, Jim Sterling. I find him kind of too acidic for my tastes. Of course, there's people who like him, but I was like, so negative. But, he was kind of polemicizing about this and pointing out people who were taking these kind of whole game assets, like it's a zombie game, low poly zombie game.
Right. Yeah.
And they were kind of taking the asset and just publishing it and kind of attach this term asset flip to it. And I do think that we should be critical of that, right? Just taking somebody else's work wholesale and putting your name on it and shipping it. I don't think that's interesting. On the other hand, I also don't think it's that problematic. Like, that's not going to take up any attention. It's not taking up.
Well, I don't want to go down this route too much, because this is an entirely different conversation on problems with storefronts and commercial.
Let's talk about it. I think it's interesting. You think it's crap. Do you really think the guy who takes Unity Asset Store zombie game and just hits build and uploads it to Steam, do you really think that's crowding I think what you're doing is the good games?
It's not crowding, but it's just adding noise where there doesn't need to be noise. You know what I mean? It's the equivalent of spam, right? I think we should do as much as we can do to reduce spam on a platform. And to some degree, it is just another form of that, right? And if you have to trudge through 50 spam games in the list of new releases this week to get to the next thing,
I mean, yeah, maybe in
So
the
it's
new
like-
releases list. There's a lot of talk about this, and I just don't feel like I experience it as a problem as a player and a buyer. Like, I just don't.
Yeah, I mean, like, there's no, I don't know enough about the sort of Steam algorithm fully
Right. It's a big black box.
to talk. Yeah, right. But I definitely know that I do look at a lot of stuff on the storefront, and I know which ones are more sort of professionally produced, I guess, versus more like. I wish there was just more stuff that was to my taste, I guess, and just things that I think are of that like higher caliber being presented on the front versus things that I have to like constantly just to get to the things that I actually want to get to. And I do see that as a player, and it's not, and and there are varying levels of quality on some of these products as well, right? You can just see it, and I just wish there was more done to raise the bar a little bit, I guess. I don't have a problem. I don't want to have this taken out of context because I'm very lucky. Like RPG Tycoon was when the whole Greenlight thing came through, right?
Right.
So I owe my quote unquote success, which it isn't, but my access to entry
But your start,
from something
right?
like that.
Your kind of ability to publish your first game. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, by no means am I saying that there shouldn't be that access. I'm just saying that like there has been an uptake in noise since that change happened, and I think that's a bad thing, and I think we need to fix it. I don't know how. You can see, especially among the indie community, talking about revenues going down. This is like a plethora of a way over complex situation that I don't think can be boiled down to just one problem.
No.
That's
key.
It's.
I mean, I think kind of like circling back to the asset flip label, the negative reaction that I had to it was I felt like, I guess this like turns into a rant about Jim Sterling, but like, there was a lot of what I felt like he was going and looking at people who had made games that were bad, games that were poorly executed, amateurish, etc. But I felt like it was kind of like, so what? This guy made a crummy game. Like, let him do his thing.
Yeah,
and
sure.
Like everybody starts
it's only
somewhere
a problem if
making
you're trying to sell
stuff.
it off as something better. Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's not malicious. I don't think the guy set out to do a bad job and like, I'm going to ship this schlocky thing. I mean, I think that for the stuff that's kind of the pure asset flip stuff, there's some element of that. I don't know. What I didn't like was that it then started this meme that then had people feeling very defensive. A lot of low-budget developers feeling very defensive about the idea that they can't use this art, and they can't do that. And I'm like, honestly, like, here's an example. Like, if you look at Cluster Truck, I don't know what the source of any of those assets were, but the art was incredible. It was clean and looked good, but it was totally generic. Like, the art, those trucks, you could have got it from anywhere. Maybe they had an artist who made that stuff. I don't know the story, right? But it was a kind of iconic, simple art style. But the gameplay was like, what? What is this? Like, you're jumping on these trucks. Like, it was kind of crazy. It was crazy, and it was felt fresh and felt exciting. And it was like, what I don't want is somebody to feel kind of gate kept out from making some crazy shit that. Because they're like not a 3D artist, and they're like, but I don't want to be called an asset flipper because I bought some trucks from the asset stores.
I think I completely agree. I think you're going into a zone where it's harder to make your game feel cohesive if you are just sourcing assets from everywhere. And it's a personal preference thing, right? You have to just accept the fact that if you're buying pre-made assets, anybody else can buy those, so your game is not unique. And that's it. That's all you have to think about it. Is that like the visual style of it. The visual style, so you can make the gameplay as unique as hell, and that's why I'm saying about the sort of tertiary, secondary thing. Yeah. Right. But like maybe you're right. Maybe it's just a perception thing. Perhaps there's tons of examples of games that have shared assets as the primary sort of visual asset. It's just on my personal preference. I want to have stuff that I own, that's mine. I mean, of course. That is unique to us in as many ways as possible.
Yeah, and I get that. And I think there's a question of prioritization, right? Where you want to invest your resources and where you want to kind of place your emphasis. I'm probably on an extreme end of that axis of just feeling like I just don't see people making bad games as a problem. I feel like we should have as many people making as many bad games as they want, because there's gonna be some wild, interesting stuff that comes out of that, I'm
an advocate, and this is why I'm sort of trying to explain that I have a very nuanced. I'm never a black and white person when it comes to this sort of stuff. We've had plenty of conversations. I'm just a little concerned that people might interpret
take it to an extreme.
Misinterpret what I'm saying, and nuance is something that I think is important. And there are always cases where all of this stuff is proven to be,
right,
untrue.
outlying.
Right? We don't know everything.
Yeah.
Right. There's tons, and so I'm just a guy making in my small little home office making crappy indie games, right?
Yeah.
Like it's just, who am I to say anything? But I think when you're in a competitive market trying to sell a product, I think it's good business personally to do as much as you can to put yourself ahead of your potential quote unquote competitors. I don't think we're competing, but you see my point being that
I think we are competing in many ways.
It's not like
when
a
we're on a
cutthroat
storefront,
sort of,
we're competing. Yeah, it's not a zero sum.
Yeah.
It's not zero sum.
Yeah, right, exactly.
But there is an element of competition.
But yeah, when you are up against another indie game that's come out the same day as you,
right?
If yours looks more unique, more interesting, right? Precisely. If you have a more visual, striking style or something that's more cohesive, you want to put the numbers in your. Right, I'm a strategy management person, so you want those sliders to be in your favor. Right?
I totally agree with that, and I think
you do right.
Yeah, I think that topic of differentiation and finding effective and achievable ways to stand out is a very interesting one. And I think is something that as indies, it's interesting, right? Because it's like, how do you tell people to have good taste? How do you tell people to be unique? How do you, it's like good design, it costs just as much to execute a bad design as it costs to execute a good design. So everybody should just have good design, right? Of course, that's not possible. But I do think that there's a interesting thought or strategy there of trying to stand out as much as possible, trying to differentiate as much as possible. And I think that your point about assets, and especially for your kind of key assets, really is applicable there, right? If your main character is an asset store character and somebody else has it in there, and it's like, it is a problem.
Yeah, right. That's exactly my point. Yeah, that's a really good way of thinking about it. I think it's also worth saying, because I know a lot of people that watch our channels are either students or they're starting out, right? So I think it's really important to mention that, as I said about Working Living the Deal, we've used tons of pre-bought assets, right?
Right.
And there's absolutely nothing wrong with doing that while you're prototyping or while you're building out most of your game, right? But for me, I just wanted to replace them, right? Because it's like, okay, cool. I've got the visual style. We've found out what works. And so I think there's nothing wrong. I'm not saying don't use assets. I'm just saying that if you want to get ahead, it would be a good idea to either make them cohesive or focus on your main assets, trying to find somebody to help you make those more unique if possible, right?
And I think there's a really cool, actionable kind of tip in there, which is what you did of saying, I need to figure out if I'm going to go into 3D. Let me grab this asset and prototype it with something that I can just pay $100 for. And then once you kind of say, we're going to move forward with this, we're committed to this as a decision. Now we can bring in the artist, we can make custom art, we can invest resources into making something refined. And as you say, that actually the aesthetic that you started with was a great jumping off point, right? So you kind of you could say to your artist, like, hey, this looks pretty good the way it is, but we need to make it our own, and then you're in a good position. So I think that's a cool approach, right? And that's something I think people can learn from.
Yeah. And I think I think that's sort of what I was trying to get at, I guess, is that it's just common practice, good business, right? To not spend loads of money on something if you're not sure about it.
Exactly, or go into a long process.
Right, you want to do as much as you can for as cheap as possible, as quick as you can to make the decision you need to make.
Yeah.
I think that's why the asset store and things like that are awesome. And I think that's what most people see it for,
as
well. I think if you talk to most developers, that's probably what they'll say, that, we used all this stuff. We bought this RPG prototype pack and whatever, and then we were like, okay, we built off of that and worked from that sort of thing. And I think most people really find that sort of stuff useful. And I love that we have access to that kind of thing, because
it's crazy.
I never would have been here without that, right? So I 100%, there's so much value in all these things. I think we're in this climate where it's like, okay, well, I want to make sure that my game sells. It is also worth pointing out, some people just want to make hobby games, and that's fine, right?
Critical point. I think that's
this
cool,
to
right?
be my career.
Yeah.
So like, again, that extra element of nuance that I want to point out is that, like, this is something that I have to think about a lot, because I want to build a brand as a studio making management games and these kind of things. And so we want to have our sort of aesthetic style and like traits that we're known for. But if you're just a hobbyist, none of this matters. Like, don't listen to me.
Totally. I no. I think that's really key, right? And I think it's important to frame those things and to be mindful of the fact that people have different goals. Not everybody is trying to make a commercial game for Steam. People are doing different things, and I think 100%. That's a really good point. I think that
games as an art form is also like a huge thing, and I think that's really valuable because it's raising questions. And then it's like, well, who gives a damn if you're using assets or not, right? Like, it's at that point, the goal is different. So
I think that's a really good point, and I think that there's a lot of interesting edge cases there that you can talk about, and people doing different aesthetics that are kind of like even a little bit based on the kind of almost like visual punk or like trash aesthetics, right? There's always kind of things that run counter to the...
Well, yeah. I mean, look, you look at Bennett Foddy, right? He made his, like, almost that entire game was asset store.
That's assets, actually right? exactly who I was thinking about. Yeah.
It's such a good example of why I'm like, don't listen to anything I say. It's just like,
always
look at this guy that made an entire... Right.
Yeah.
But then my argument there would be that he was really creative in how he used those assets, right? And like leaned into it almost.
Exactly. And another person who I think of in that same conversation is Sosowski, the Polish developer, with his crazy VR game. And he was doing crazy stuff. He bought like a bus on the asset store, and then he would like open it up in Blender and model the inside for it that wasn't there, and like just really kind of like taking these assets and chopping them up and then...
Well, I think that's that's an interesting conversation, though, because that's sort of similar to what I was getting at, where, I think using them as a jumping off point is really valuable, right? And once you start messing with them, then it's that sort of Creative Commons thing, right? Once you start doing that, then it's at that point you've built onto something, and then it's something else, and you're just using that. I think that's creativity, right? You look
totally
most things, right? Music and movies and like that. That's just taking inspiration from something, building on it to make something else.
Yeah, it's kind of collage and sampling.
Yeah, collage. Yeah, that's the word I was thinking of. Yeah. And I think that's really valuable. So because that's often, I think, how art forms tend to evolve.
Yeah,
so
totally. No, I think that's really interesting. Well, so something else that we're kind of circling around a little bit here is this idea of market saturation. People have been talking for a couple of years about the indie apocalypse, stores getting more and more crowded. One of the people that I've just been listening to over the past couple of days is Ryan Clark.
And based out of where I am.
Is he? Is he over there in Vancouver?
Yeah, he's in Vancouver. Yeah.
No kidding.
Brace yourself.
Yeah, I loved Necrodancer. I love what he does. And I think the way that he's thinking about the business of being an indie developer, which is kind of seems like a theme that we're circling around here, is like this idea of focusing on hooks and doing market research and trying to position an idea at the idea stage as something
I completely
to be commercially viable.
I think this is like, you need, like, if you are, again, caveating this, if you're going into this to make money, you want to build a studio and make money, I think the product that you make, the decision you make, and the audience, like any business, right? It would be insane to go into a town that's full of bars and restaurants. Let's say that they're all craft beer and to then open up another one. You know, it's like you're setting your chances to succeed. You're competing against yourself in that situation, right? It's like, it's just good business to try and find the niche. I mean, we talk about this, like this is why we have our YouTube channels, right? That we've tried to find a niche and cater to that. So that's one of the reasons why, to some degree, I chose to make sim management games.
Yeah.
This is something I strongly believe. We'll find out when I release my games, right? Let's cut back to this in a year's time or whatever when we launch.
Yeah.
But I strongly believe that management games and sort of tycoon things tend to do quite well because it's a heavily PC audience. The genre is quite difficult to make, but also the genre, it's not a one and done. It's not a zero, like you said, zero-sum game.
Yeah.
I own Parkitect. I own Planet Coaster. I don't own Roller Coaster Tycoon just because it was so poorly reviewed.
Yeah.
But I'll own Tycoon Game X, Tycoon Game Y, Tycoon Game Z, even if they're all the same skin, you know?
Right.
Because the design of those games is more about the execution of the management systems and mechanics, and often they're different enough to make them interesting, right? So I would say that like Parkitect is a very core sim tycoon management game.
Yeah.
Whereas Planet Coaster is more of a creative sandbox.
Yeah,
right?
interesting.
So they're leans much more into the sandbox thing than it does a deep sim like Roller Coaster Tycoon 2 was, right? Whereas that's what Parkitect sort of is trying to do. And so whereas I would never try to make a first-person shooter, I probably would never try to make a third-person action game, really probably wouldn't try to do a couch co-op game specifically for PC, because
It's a bad idea.
that seems counterintuitive to the PC, it's one person. So
Yeah.
I don't know. I think there is definitely something to be said about choosing a genre that is going to work for the target platform and audience. It's like mobile games are a very specific style and design for a specific reason.
Yeah.
And I think you have to sort of apply that similar logic to PC games versus console games. I don't think management games work well on console.
Right, just because of the input method, right? It's like it's a kind of a mouse game.
And up until now, it was also, restrictions of the hardware too. It's just
interesting. Yeah.
complex systems and mechanics and simulations that potentially PCs could do a bit better.
Yeah.
So
that's interesting.
But yeah, input method also I think is just, I don't think I've ever really played one on console that's felt good. Great. It's just like,
yeah.
And that's personal preference too, I'm sure.
Sure,
there might be people that are playing City Skylines or whatever, but I don't know. I just think, again, it goes back to that general business thing outside of the games, is it's just, you think about companies and trying to make good investments and take the right risks.
Yeah.
Is why wouldn't you apply that same knowledge when you're starting out on a project?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think I was just rewatching, it's top of mind for me because I was just rewatching this talk he did it was 2018 about something like how to make successful commercial games, right? So it's there in the title, right? That this is kind of commercial advice. He had this kind of Venn diagram of you need a game that has an existing market, right? There is some audience that's not either kind of dying or oversaturated. You need something that you feel excited to make, right?
Yes.
Which is key. And something that you potentially have the resources to make, right? Whether those are resources of skill, money, time, team,
knowledge to some degree.
Knowledge,
right?
Exactly.
Yeah, and this is the big thing for me, is I actually don't care if my games make money, which is counts as everything I've just said, but because it's stuff I want to play. And I tend to do this with a lot of my creative projects, right? So my YouTube videos, my entire channel was set up for a version of me a year ago that didn't know the things that I know now.
Yeah.
That's sort of how I talk about Game Dev Guide, is it's like, I'm making videos for myself a year ago to solve this problem quickly rather than take the 2 months. So with Living the Deal, it's just a game I really want to make. And when I finish it, it's something that I'm going to want to play. And if I don't want to play it, it's not a game that I want to make.
I mean, that's a very real and authentic motivation, right? I think that, maybe you could go work in kind of banking because you're just in it for the money. But I think in a creative field like games, I just can't imagine folks being successful who are just saying, oh, I heard that mobile farming games are really big. I'm just going to go make one. Maybe the kind of the Zyngas and so on of the world can do that and make it work, but I don't think it works. I don't think it's viable. I think you have to be either kind of a member of the target player base or at the very least kind of passionate about the genre, the idea.
Yeah, and I think generally speaking, most of the people I know that are working in indie games, are always passionate about the projects they're working on. I think to some degree though, they also have 5 or 6 different types of games that they want to make at any given time.
Yeah.
And they're prototyping them, or they've got them in whatever stage at whatever point, because the realistic, from the business standpoint of it, is you've got to do that because, the market changes, the publishers' guidelines change, what they're looking for.
Yeah.
That's it. That's the word. Yeah. And so you should sort of have your fingers in a few pies.
Yeah.
We have 3 projects we were already planning on doing after Living the Deal.
Yeah.
We don't know which one we're going to do first.
Right. And
we'll figure that out.
Yeah, no, and that's a really good point, I think. And I think that even the thing that makes that even harder about making games commercially is that you're not just thinking about the market as it exists, but you're trying to time the market 2 years out or 4 years out, right?
Oh yeah.
And at that moment, I am struck by talking to some of my developer friends and hearing how some things like platform deals or kind of really key business opportunities and decisions really are made kind of at the end, like right before release, at the end of the process.
Yeah.
And it's just because at this moment, Epic is the one giving out money, or Microsoft is the one giving out money, or they've got a new platform that they're launching they need games for, right?
Yeah.
And I think that that's such a tricky thing, because it's like nobody could have predicted a couple of years ago that Epic was going to be buying exclusive rights for everybody's game and giving them big bags of money. But then, you know, this year or this past year, kind of, I think it's slowed down now, but that was a pattern. And then Apple showed up and started buying a lot of stuff and giving people money, and it's kind of unknowable, right? So I think that's also interesting. Yeah. You know, I was talking to one friend who was had some opportunities with some publishers and was trying to make a decision about whether to make a deal now or to wait. And I'm like, honestly, probably you should wait, because unless you need the money for development now, right?
Right. And I think that's like the decision you want to make, right? I have a biz dev guy.
Yeah.
He's a really experienced producer, biz dev for lots of different publishers. That's his sort of history. And so he's really good at this sort of stuff. But most of our conversations come down to, if we're going to get offered money now to mean that we can finish the game, then we'll take it.
Right.
You know, because it's like, we really only care about funding the studio to the next game.
Yeah.
Obviously we care about like growing it.
Yeah.
But from as far as I'm concerned, I just want to be able to keep doing this and do it as full time, because I love what I do and I love making games. I love talking about games. I love being able to work on Game Dev Guide.
Yeah.
You know, I'm not huge, like I want to make mega millions. I just want to have a sustainable thing where I don't want to have to worry about money too much. And so if somebody comes along and says, here, look, we're going to fund the entire rest of your game. Here's the money to do it. You've got security for, 6 to 12 months.
Yeah.
That's awesome, right?
Absolutely.
And I think if you look at the big deals that have gone down, like the Double Fine purchase from Microsoft, right?
Yeah.
You look at what Tim Schafer says, and he was like, I don't have to worry about if I'm going to be able to pay my employees now. And that's the best feeling in the world.
You see from some of the documentaries and stuff that they did that he definitely, at multiple instances in their history, was facing payroll and like squeaking through and, making...
And that level of like responsibility and you just want to, make people's lives better and happier, right? Because...
Not have to fire really all your friends, like...
Yeah, right. Yeah, well, exactly. Yeah. So, I think if that's the thing is you go from that struggle to things being slightly easier, and you have to make that business decision of whether taking that money is worth it, right? Because there are always caveats to getting money from somebody else.
Yeah, exactly. And you're giving up some independence, and you're giving up future flexibility and so on.
But I think it, obviously will always depend on the terms of the contract and the deal or whatever.
Yeah.
But most of the time, I would probably say that, but if the terms are good within your own personal feeling about it, why wouldn't you be able to fund yourself for the next 12 months or whatever on forward from that? And I think that's really, really an interesting thing, because also I guess the other side of it is like the pedigree behind it, right? Is that if you've released 5 games that have done reasonably well with names behind it or whatever, versus you're new to the scene with no money and no track record.
Yeah. No, that's true. That's kind of the long game that I think is a really relevant question. Yeah.
And I do think there is that element of some short-mindedness sometimes when we have these conversations with people, because it's like, well, look, if your goal is really just to make the next game, then you can be short-minded about it. If you have a studio plan and you want to be like a team of 100 people making like the next Bethesda game, you know, like that kind of thing, that huge immersive RPG, sure, you have to be more careful about what you do. But you look at the history. I mean, I've just watched the Arcane doc from NoClip. Great channel. Yeah. Highly recommend the NoClip channel.
Totally.
Danny's doing the Lord's work, really, right? Doing these documentaries. Same with the Creative Assembly ones, right? Most of them have come from doing contract work and working as outsourcing or porting. And you look at a lot of, I have friends that are working on porting and contract work, and I'm doing it myself, right? Like,
that's what we're doing at Thousand Ant, right? Is we have client work that's coming in, and then it's funding our YouTube and our game development. And for me, having been a freelancer for years, doing all kinds of weird different freelance jobs for people, I'm quite comfortable with that model. Like, I'm the idea that, I do my client projects and then I fund whatever else that I'm working on.
Yeah.
I'm quite comfortable with that. I know for some people, it might be hard not to be immersed full time in whatever their creative project is. And I'm sympathetic to that, right? If I won the lottery, or I just had a hit game and had a big pile of money, I wouldn't be doing contract work either. But in an environment where, I have to choose between that or maybe kind of, putting all my chips on red and just saying, forget it, I've got a year worth of savings, I'm just going to go all in. Like, that's, also it's like your risk tolerance, right? But for me, I'm like,
Yeah. So I think, like, if you look at what a lot of these studios do is they'll team up and then they'll take jobs, but they'll work in man months, right? So exactly what Thousand Ant are doing, right? It's like, we have a team of people, a skill to do this, and it's like strength in numbers kind of thing versus. Whereas I'm also a freelancer that works for other teams and whatever, right? Like, I found that way after leaving Unity. That's how I made my money after leaving Unity, right? And it's been interesting to be a part of both of those worlds, but also it's totally common, right? Because the reason I left Unity and the reason that I leave full-time gigs or full-time contract gigs that I end up working on is that I'm not being able to dedicate that focus. So I totally get that argument behind it.
Right.
I think finding that rhythm of working to pay the bills and keep the lights on in an industry that ultimately is great to work in, isn't that hard. Like, it isn't super.
It's not breaking rocks on the chain gang, that's for sure.
Yeah, right. Like, I'm not going to say there isn't problems, but you're not out every day like sweating and there's not physically enduring in that same way. That it's quite a cushy industry to work in, especially if you're passionate about it. That's the other big thing, is that it does definitely make you want to stay. And your mind is always in one place. And so I think that for me, that sort of contract background behavior, it's because it's sort of testament to just how you move forward. You can build up a revenue that way. You can work on things, and then eventually maybe that one thing does hit. But you also build those relationships.
That's what I was going to say.
I guess that's sort of the point
You're learning.
Yeah, that's the point I was going to try and make.
People. Like, I think there's a lot of non-monetary value.
Right. If I look at my history of like those 4 years that I've been working on Living the Deal, right, everything I've done and the contacts I've made in doing all this different contract work for different people up until then has been so valuable, right? It's like that year at Unity, then the year of, full freelancing on lots of different games and projects, and then starting work with Thousand Ant and the YouTube channel, has been such a different journey, and the different types of people that I've met and connections you've been able to make,
Yeah, totally. I totally agree. I mean, I think like one of the things I'm always focused on in terms of work stuff is finding opportunities where I'm continuing to learn. We worked together at Unity, and I was there for a couple of years after you left, and I had this process where when I started there, I had this very steep, rapid learning growth. Like because I came in with relatively weak programming knowledge, Unity knowledge. I knew a little bit, but not that much, and I kind of
same actually.
That's also as like kind of strategically for people thinking about how to kind of move forward. Like for me, I was a musician, I was doing video freelance stuff, and I went into Unity at a kind of a relatively low level. It was like a 4-year degree that I got paid for. You know what I mean? Like that was crazy. But I did, and then I was there for 5.5 years or something. But in that, later period of the curve, also I got into management, which is like a whole different thing. But like, I felt like my learning was kind of plateauing. And that was, for me, was one of the signals to be like, okay, it's time to go back to being independent, or, it was like, I just started to feel like, okay, I'm kind of repeating. I'm not really learning in this crazy hockey stick kind of way anymore.
Yeah.
But honestly, that thing of like being able to get paid to learn all this stuff over, 4 or 5 years, it's like, it's bananas. It's amazing.
Well, I think that's the value for other people to maybe potentially, join another studio for a while.
Yeah, exactly.
To work on. Yeah. If people are listening to this are looking to get into games, right? Independent isn't necessarily the best way to get started.
Right.
And just go, even though that's kind of what I did. But then after that, like, I left university, I worked on RPG Tycoon, which was made in ActionScript. And that was like a complete crash course in game design and game programming.
Yeah.
And, much like most people probably do with their previous projects, I now open it and I just sense dread that was able to be released, right?
But that's another interesting topic, right? Clean versus finished,
Well, yeah, exactly. And that was my crash course, but then doing all the work at Unity and the next 4 years, right, up to working at sort of 2018 and then moving forward from that, was when I learned everything else that I learned, right? And like I've become a better game designer just through working on lots of different projects and things. So even though I didn't necessarily go straight through that, like working at a AAA studio or whatever, or an indie studio, I sort of went independent, then went full time, and then went independent again. That gap in that middle there, where I've done all that stuff and worked, and that's really where I've learned the most, definitely.
I think it's huge. I think it's good kind of blanket advice for people, especially people starting out. But honestly, I think at any stage in your career, or someone like me, like I was a little older when I wanted to change careers, I think that focusing on taking opportunities where you're going to have a huge potential to learn, as opposed to necessarily saying, I have to go into something that's really high paid directly. It's like being able to learn and get paid, even if maybe you're taking a little bit of hit on the earnings side, if you can afford it, is really valuable and can kind of springboard you into the next stage, So we talk a lot about business, money, and careers. I want to shift gears and talk about another topic that we love to talk about, you and I, on our non-recorded phone calls, which is programming, and specifically game architecture in Unity. Okay. It's a spicy one, right?
I'm going to quickly grab a drink while you talk about introducing this, right? You introduce this.
Okay.
Just because my mouth's drying up.
Do it.
Sorry
to do this. That's good. No, so basically the context is, right, one of the things I can kind of reflect back on the conversation that Matt and I were having a couple of days ago. One of the things that I think is missing from the tutorial landscape, and obviously Matt and I are both YouTube content creators, right, and worked on tutorials at Unity, and so that's something we talk and think a lot about. One of the things that I think is missing from the tutorial landscape, right, is sharing some of this thinking about creating architecture that scales, being able to design things that work into bigger projects, tooling, creating things that are going to work past a tiny demo or a game jam. And I think that it's hard to talk about, right, because it's a big subject, but I think that you and I have had some interesting talks. So I want to start us off with a controversial one.
Go on.
Which is, I've been talking to a lot of folks about this kind of scriptable object paradigm, and I'm getting a lot of feedback on it, positive and negative. And one of the things that I hit on today, I was actually just recording another video for our YouTube channel about this asset that implements that pattern. But one of the things that I kind of promised to do, and now I have to deliver on, is to say, okay, I've been talking about this pattern and its advantages, but I think in the interest of completeness, we should talk about the disadvantages. Sure. You know what I mean? Like, I don't think it's a good idea to talk about, just be like, this tool, right? It's like, this is a hammer. It's great. It's like, well, if you try to fix your windows with it, you might have a bunch of broken glass, right? So it's like, I think every tool can be applied in different ways. So anyway, I wanted to get your hot take on that, and maybe in the context of your project.
Sure. I mean, I love scriptable objects, but I love them as a data asset, and a data asset mostly only. Yeah. Right? I don't like them as a design architecture for systems and mechanics, because I don't like cluttering my project with thousands of assets. Yeah. Because that to me is harder to read than like just a line of code. Right. And that's just a personal preference thing. Right. Like, I will use them as extended enums, but I also really like using enums because I like that just drop down selection stuff that like I have some other issues because I do all my serialization through the binary formatter as well. Yeah. That using them as data assets that you're storing and moving and toying with at runtime. Yeah. I don't like either. So, because often what I'm doing is I'm making a script, I'm storing scriptable objects as I try to think of them as extended spreadsheets with like functionality, because my favorite thing about doing things in scriptable objects is they can hold your custom classes, right? Yes. So I can have like my weapon, right? I think we used this example before, right? And it's like, cool. So now, rather than having to like name this through an ID in a spreadsheet, I can actually just toy with this data set, right? Yeah. But that's as far as I go with it most of the time. Is I use it to set up a bunch of like asset structs, right? It's like, this is stuff that's not going to change, and I'm not going to do anything crazy with it. It's just there to be represented as a series of data that I'm going to pull from, but I'm never going to push to, right? I'm just going to pull from it. Yeah, absolutely. And I'm not even going to try and move it around, right? Once it's in the game, it's translated and it's something else now. It may have an ID so that I can get back to it. And a good example of this is, so in Living the Deal, we have businesses, right? Mm-hmm. So all of the business data needs to be generated dynamically because there's like growth and stats and whatever. Right. And through various reasons, we've gone through a couple of different iterations of what we were storing in scriptable objects. But what I've ended up going with is just like some information about the business type, name variants, because we randomly generate the name of that sort of type of business, and then potential ranges of things that it can generate between, right? So maybe its value will be between $10,000, $100,000.
Yeah.
And that's all it is. It's just that sort of level of data. And then when the game takes it, it goes, okay, what's my like source? This is my source. Then it generates a serializable class from that point, because I need to save that business data somewhere, because the game needs a context of like what's available to the player and all this stuff. So it has to lose that connection at some point, right?
Yeah. So I really like this approach, and this is exactly what I wanted to talk about. I think that one of the things that people get there's a bunch of things you said there that are interesting to touch on. But I think one of the things that people get confused about is the idea of people using scriptable objects as variables, and then they're pushing data into them.
Yeah, I don't like that.
Yeah, I don't like that either.
I really don't like that.
And then you end up with a situation where you have a bunch of data that's in a funky format to serialize, or you can't. Or you're dragging a lot of references to scriptable objects, and those references can't be serialized. It's
super designer friendly.
Yeah.
It is not engineer friendly, and that's what I don't like about it. Right? Is that I want a good symbiosis between both. I want a good synergy between, because I do consider myself, very designer heavy in the way that I work in Unity.
Yeah.
But I also like to understand my program. Right.
Yeah.
So. I do a lot of work to make. I do that assessment often. It's like, okay, is it going to be faster just to code this out, or can I build a tool that's going to make this faster to design? Right. And so often that's where I play around with. And if the assessment goes like, I could just write this in code in 30 minutes versus, playing around these assets for like 2 hours, then I'm going to do the code decision.
Right.
So it's like that's the constant balance for me. And the like designer variable thing is just I get the point. If you're working with people that don't want to touch code, you then have to do that sort of layer of abstraction. Yeah. But not a fan of that.
No, I understand what you mean, and I think it's interesting. And I think one of the things that in working with this pattern lately on my Untitled Cute Space game that I've been making videos about, are you
ever going to have a name for it? Or are you just going to call it?
It's funny. Somebody on the channel was like, you should just call it Cute Space Game. And I was like, wait a minute. It's probably going to end up shipping as Untitled Cute Space Game. We'll see. Somebody said I should call it Asteroid Crossing. I was like, whoa, get sued by Nintendo. I gotta come up with a title. I just don't want to. Oh, titles are hard.
Yeah, don't worry about it.
But one of the things that's becoming clear to me with working with that pattern is exactly what you say, and specifically hinging on this idea of serialization. And one of the ways that I'm starting to, and I think I'm going to make like a little tutorial about this, but one of the ways that I'm starting to really think about it is you have mutable data, right, which is runtime data, like exactly in your example. The ranges that a business is going to generate in is not going to change at runtime, right? That is design time authoring that you're gonna define, and is going to be the same for the life cycle of the game. The individual instances that get generated out of that, the random name, that number between 10,000 and 100,000.
Precisely.
That's what I would kind of what I've been thinking about as kind of mutable data, right, or runtime data.
Yep.
And that very clearly in my mind should not be living in an asset. That should be living in a JSON file or a serializable class or whatever. And I think you can think of it as, right, like my game is called runtime player data or something, because it's like, this is all data that gets generated at runtime. It needs to be saved. It's going to change all the time. It's going to be written to, and let's be clear about what that is. And let's definitely not have that persisting in assets in our project folder or anything weird. Like I definitely have seen people doing that where they're like, writing variables into the scriptable object, and then I'm like, wait, but you're going to play the game, and that's going to still be there. Like, don't do that, right? So
unless you make the field private. right? That's the thing. It's only public variables that get, or serialized variables. But if you make it private, you can then. So there's ways around that. It's not strictly true that scriptable objects
will persist
always
the data.
change.
Yeah.
Right. Well, yeah. You can make. There's ways to make them not persist. But then at that point, like, why isn't it just a class? It's like.
Yeah. I was actually just recording a video on today that is this scriptable. It's somebody took the kind of idea of Ryan Hipple and Richard Fine and made a free asset out of it, which I really like. And one of the things that I really like is, Hipple put forward this idea of scriptable object variables, which is like an asset that you put an int inside, right?
Yeah.
Which I kind of looked at it and was like, it's interesting, but why? And I mean, I do see some value to it, but what this guy has hooked up in his pattern is it's an asset that you can plug into an event field. Now it's kind of like a asset for a callback,
Yeah, it's like the timeline signals, right?
Exactly. That's actually really similar implementation. Yeah, and that I really like.
I don't like that either.
Okay, let's go.
Because it ties all of your event logic to the inspector, right?
That's true.
And
that's true.
If you let's for instance, let's say the function you want to call is in a different scene. If you're using scene layering, right? You have a UI scene, you have a core persistent scene or something, right? You then maybe have a sound scene or something.
Right.
Well, what if you want your UI scene to talk to your sound scene? Either you've got to merge them, but if you're doing event things, you can't cross hook things up that way.
Even if it's through an asset, though, isn't that kind of one of the advantages of the asset-based approach, right? Is that it's the reference lives in the project.
I mean, if you're using Unity events, as you're then tied into the restriction of what a Unity event can do.
Oh, if you're raising a Unity event. So, I got you.
Yeah. So there's the other things, which is like Unity events can't take colors, they can't take,
custom objects.
They can only take string. Yeah, they can't take custom objects and all this stuff. And it's just like, again, it goes back to that point of like, well, okay, if I have to work around that, then why don't I just do it in code, right? That's the thing with me is I have a video on my channel about a custom event system that's just a static thing, which is a similar thing, but it's all just done in code, right?
Yeah.
And at that point, in 2 lines, I can write a customized game event system. There's also that level of like strictness is that I know when this thing is being called, it will only take this type of object and this type of object too, right? Which with a scriptable object approach is way more agnostic. You can end up potentially accidentally, especially if a designer is touching it, they don't necessarily know the ins and outs. You have the danger of,
cross wiring or something.
And then you've got to handle that. And it's like,
no, that's true. That's
a little bit more.
I think that's a good point. And I think the ability to pass a kind of a custom data packet via an event is a desirable thing, and it's something that, as far as I've seen this, or at least without kind of going in and rewriting it, isn't well supported. So I think that's a pretty valid
because I mean,
objection.
Often what you end up doing, you create a monobehavior, right, with a function in it, and then usually something in the inspector with some like assets that you do want to pass through.
Yeah.
You make a button, and then you make the button call that monobehavior that then calls the function that does the thing that you actually want to do in the first place.
Yeah.
So it's like you've just added an extra step in there where there shouldn't be one,
Yeah. No, I definitely have seen that. I saw myself doing that when I was working with this pattern, that I was adding all these event listeners to stuff that I didn't need. I think you have to find that right border, right? The level of granularity that you want. I mean,
this is... this is the thing that I think we spoke about, right? Is that my caveat to most of these systems that people propose is that it's great if you're working on a very small thing, but as soon as you start scaling up, as soon as you start working with lots of data, lots of things, right? It's like if you're working on a very small game and it's manageable, sure, fine, whatever, right? But I've run into so many of these things where people are like, why don't you do this system? And it's like, because it doesn't work at scale. Or like it makes, like at scale, it becomes a nightmare to deal with.
And that's some of the feedback that I've been getting from YouTube and stuff, is people being like, I would never use this on a big project. Like this is going to end up with 10,000 assets. And I think that's good to put that out there, right? I don't know if that's a disqualifier for the approach, right? But I think
it's not a disqualifier, it's a caveat, right? It's
exactly.
And I think it's nuance. It's the same thing. I've repeated this so much during this conversation, but the thing that I think I said this to you like last week or whatever, is that there's definitely an attitude that it's like there is only one way to do things, right?
Right.
There is never one way to do things.
Yeah.
What matters is you get the game done.
Exactly.
Right?
And that's really important, right? Yeah, exactly. And that's the thing that I hope that we can push through in all of these discussions about patterns and approaches and so on, is like fundamentally we want to be pragmatic and productive, right? The whole reason we're thinking about this stuff is because we want to ship the game, not because we want to play Tetris with programming, you know?
I've had a few people in the in my Discord talk about this actually, and they're really quite concerned about picking the right thing.
Yes.
And I've tried to come out and I've tried to be like, it doesn't, honestly, just pick whichever one you think is going to work for you right now and worry about it later if it doesn't work.
Yeah.
Right? Because it's like, I think it's generally good to think about, to have some foresight. But if anything game design has taught me is that, 6 months down the line, you'll face a problem that you didn't know existed 6 months ago.
Absolutely.
And you'll ultimately, there's no way to avoid that no matter what, because you only know as much as you know when you know it.
Totally.
And you can also, there's like I think the comment, the way I think about it is like there's known knowns and there's known unknowns.
Yeah.
And then just unknown unknowns, right? It's like there's like three things there.
Yeah.
And like just act on your known knowns.
Yeah.
Potentially think about your known unknowns of like, okay, this could be a problem later.
Yeah.
So we'll have to keep it in mind, but don't worry about it until you hit that point, because you'll probably find a solution that works. And honestly, if you end up having to rip stuff out, then you've learned something new there, right? You're like, okay, well, this works up to this point.
Right.
And that's where a lot of my attitude comes from, is because I've done it. I've tried these things.
Yeah.
And then I found the problems that they have and why they don't work for me in the type of games that I make.
Yeah.
But that's why certain other architectures work perfectly for smaller types of games or different types of games. And it's like, it's so bespoke from project to project. And
I think that's a really critical context as well, right? Is that if it's like a 2-player co-op game, you're never going to have 10,000 different pieces of data, right? It's just something, you could take a very different approach.
Yeah, 100%. And I think it's like, I'm definitely a advocate of the design, like the iterative design mentality. It's slightly slower, but I like the figure out the game, feel how it feels, prototype a system, not necessarily just prototype the game, but I often will just prototype a system.
Yeah.
So that sort of minimum viable product, right? If it's like, what do I need to do to get this to a point where I know if this is the right path?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And I do that with every sprint that we work on, is that like, it's okay, this is going to be the MVP of the battle system.
Yeah.
This is going to be the MVP of the like chapter logic. This is going to be the MVP. The next thing I'm doing today is literally the MVP of the shopping system, right?
Yeah.
So the players can change their clothes. I have no idea how I want it to look. I'm just going to implement something that I think will work, stick to that until it doesn't work, and then change it. It's
absolutely. And I think that's...
And just make minor tweaks,
Yeah, I think it's like, don't solve a problem until it's a problem, right? Don't try to kind of pre-defend against... Because I think this is something people get very hung up, especially programmers get very hung up on performance, right? They're like, well...
Right.
What if we have 10,000 of those objects? Well, it's like, well, do you have 10,000 of those objects?
Right.
Well, no, we have 2 of them. But if we had 10,000, it would be slow. It's like, yeah, but you have 2 of them. So stop it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Worry about performance when performance is a problem.
Yeah.
And then optimize for that, right? Like, obviously, I think there's again, the nuance is you should always be mindful of
course,
it, right?
Course.
And I have many comments in my script that says this is probably not very optimal.
Yeah,
this might be a problem in like.
It's funny.
A year's time.
I just realized that I was recording a YouTube video and I had like my time script and I have like a bunch of comments and they're like, maybe this is bad. We're converting a double to an int and just cutting off the data. This is probably bad. But I'm like. That's production code. So, it's like, this is what's really happening.
Right. And that's a good point to say. It's production code, right? And like I've worked on a number of different prototypes, AAA games, whatever, right? Like I've seen production code.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter how things work, why they work, as long as it works.
Yeah.
And that's really the truth, is like, as long as it works and it isn't causing problems elsewhere, nobody will care.
Yeah.
Right. They'll look at it and they might go, this could probably be better.
Yeah.
But I don't see any problem with it. Right. Like, this isn't slowing it down. Right. Like, until it becomes the problem, because there's just so many spinning plates at any given time on a game project. Right. It's just like, you really shouldn't be worrying about the plate that's still spinning.
Yeah, exactly. Unless it's falling towards the floor. Yeah. No, I think that's a really, really good point. And like, I think that is on the conversation about like performance, it's like, it's so contextual. If we're doing this operation every frame, if we actually have 10,000 of them, but it's like, if we're doing this once a second and there's 2 instances of it, it could be slow as hell. It doesn't matter. Like, it's, you know what I mean? Like, you could do some super expensive operation. It's like you're doing it when the user clicks a button and nothing else is happening. It's fine.
Right. Right. Yeah. And I think like you want to look at, and that's why the profiling tools and stuff are really important. I do think it's important to like always check and look at your profiler. And if you're concerned about frame time, and again, it's also like target platform, right? If you're targeting PC, you don't have to worry as much, right? Because PC hardware is much less restricted depending on who you're targeting, than say like a PS4, right? A PS4 or whatever, you have very strict requirements of memory, graphics, like IO speed, all these kind of things, right? And if you're trying to do level streaming and you've got these like 1,000 try polygons, right? With hundreds of vertices, and you're not doing lodding properly, and and you're not using Unreal Engine 5. Yeah,
exactly. You're not just streaming
then that's where you that's when you have to worry about it. And
that's interesting. Oh, let's talk about Unreal Engine 5 for a second. So I think that's that is, as Matt and I are both kind of pretty committed participants of the Unity ecosystem. The Unreal thing came out and everybody was, everybody's like, oh my gosh, but I think that's actually a cool example there, what they were showing of that was so tied into the PS5 architecture. The way that they're doing all this vertex streaming and data streaming was like this totally bespoke architecture tied to there's some new storage streaming tech that's built into the PS5. They have like a dedicated, almost like GPU for decompressing data, which is super interesting. But for me, that's talking about optimization and speed and stuff. That's a really cool example of like, they're hooking so deeply into this specific platform architecture that they can do this very unique, very like wow kind of stuff. And it was really interesting. Like they were not promoting, Xbox just got was just nowhere in the picture, right? It was all Sony, PlayStation 5, everything was hooked in, the demo's running on a PS5, and there's some interesting business failed negotiations there, or something with Microsoft. Something happened there. Like I was a notable omission. You know what I mean? Like there's 2 big next gen platforms, and only one of them is like really tightly supported.
Yeah, I mean it's also probably worth pointing out that was a very closed demo, right? It's like anything, but at the same time, that global illumination tech, man.
Super impressive. Ooh. Super impressive.
Especially when Unity won't have one for another 2 years.
Yeah. Like absolutely. No. I think that they the thing that I think is really interesting there is it's going to be the fact that you can, and of course it all remains to be seen if it's true, and it's tied to the PS5 and everything, so we got to see it kind of come out into reality, but the idea that you can just take high poly assets and slap them into an engine with that level of fidelity and the real-time GI and all that stuff, for people who are coming from a high poly asset pipeline to start with, like who have big libraries of high poly assets, it's like, it's major. It's it's going to be really valuable.
You do have that one caveat of like, okay, but what does that do to the project size, right? It's just like, I worked on the multiplayer for Crackdown 3. I was doing some UI work, right? And that alone was huge. Just to like download and work on and open, right? It would take like 20 minutes to open just because it was such a big
just get
project, right? And it's just like, that's my other concern to a lot of this is just like, okay, where is then the new bottleneck in the pipeline, right? Because there's always going to be one.
Totally. And in the authoring pipeline and what's that going to be like to work with that data and stuff. Yeah.
So it's exciting and the tech is cool. I do agree that it's going to open up a lot of potential to certain studios with maybe bigger budgets or better
I think that's actually really key, right? That's who's going to have the kind of firepower to really
the real time. So that's why I said there's like the texture streaming stuff is really cool.
Yeah.
But ultimately, I think the lower end of developers may not be able to. We'll see when we touch, like when it comes out and we see the real, like how it actually, under the hood of it, right?
Right.
But I do think the GI thing is like
big. Yeah.
big, right? Because GI is in tons of and to have it be smart like that, and because real-time GI is really hard too, right? Like that's
absolutely.
And usually you have to pre-compute it massively.
Yeah.
So if it can interact with the physics systems and all this sort of stuff in real time, and in the way that it looked like it was doing in the demo, I actually also quite liked the IK stuff that was happening. I know most people brushed over that part of the demo, but like the IK hand placement and stuff, I'm like, cool. As somebody who's been playing with IK a lot recently, I'm like, damn, that's awesome, right? If it's like that clever. As people who have worked internally in places, we know, I suppose, how much is really tightened down for a demo, and what that actually ends up looking like for production. I think most people that have worked with Unity have seen some of the Unity demos, and then they've played around with them and they've realized sort of where some of the boundaries are there. And so as a developer, I think it's worth being like, okay, the tech is really cool. Let's just see how much it works in practice for, what are the specific parameters that are going to need to be aligned for this to actually be implemented. Right.
I mean, I think the big, huge one is like, what if I'm not targeting PS5? What can I do then?
Right. Yeah, true. Yeah.
That's a big one, right? Like, not everybody's targeting PS5.
For PC, I think it will be fine, right? Because...
Yeah, but I don't know, though. Big chunks of it will be fine, right? But a lot of what they were talking about with all this crazy data streaming stuff sounds like... I mean, it may be that we all need to buy a decompression card for our PC as in the next generation, and that's the thing or something.
Yeah.
There's some crazy storage... the SSD's not fast enough, and it's the next thing,
I guess I'm more slapdash about that, because if you're on a PC, you can make that change very easily.
Yes.
If that tech comes along, you have much more accessibility to do that, right? I think it definitely is a bigger conversation if you're comparing it between tech in these boxed consoles or whatever. But when you have, when you can get under the hood of a PC, right? Like RTX is a big thing.
Yeah.
It's like, that's cool. I don't have one yet, but in 5 years' time, they'll be in every PC, right? So it's like,
Yeah. No, I think that's important. Interestingly, no, I feel like that was like a meme for a while, the like real-time ray tracing stuff, but there's no mention of that in the Unreal demo.
No, that's a good point.
It's kind of like...
No. But I mean, I guess that's because they're doing it in the, like, there is the ray tracing as part of their GI system, right? Of the
I guess,
textures and things. I remember they were talking a little bit about like what they were doing with rays, but
it was. I mean, you could see somebody was pointing out on Twitter that like, you could see that it takes a few frames to catch up, and which is obviously still very impressive and powerful.
So, but that's why I like doing what we're doing, where we're trying to showcase and you talk about your devlogs, right? And it's trying to showcase to people that are interested in potential, because I think gamers often turn into developers, right?
Of course.
Because I am. That's exactly that, right?
Yeah.
So, but I also just think like most people need that sense of nuance, a bit more nuance, and I keep coming back to that for some reason.
That's the theme. That's the ring a bell, right? That's the word of the day. No, but I think that's really, and it's like really valid and important.
And I think it's like sometimes you just have to like nothing in life is black and white, even when it looks like it's black and white. And it's just like but when we're talking about a product and a company and a game and whatever, like most people working on these things want to make good stuff. And I think people listening to this are making games. You want to make a good thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
And that's I think one thing that we're pretty blessed in specifically within the developer community. And, you and I both make kind of developer-focused YouTube content and all that kind of stuff. And that generally speaking, the developer community is very empathetic and aware of these realities, right? But I do think it's a good point. And I think that maybe as indie developers I know that people wrestle, and maybe this is an interesting topic for us to touch on and then kind of bring things to a close, but I think people wrestle with the degree of openness and kind of how much to show and how much to share and how much to kind of let people behind the curtain.
Yeah.
And my thinking is definitely evolving on this as well, but at the moment, I'm kind of in a posture of saying, I think that the more we can show people the reality of what it looks like to make games, caveat as an indie, right, which is a unique sort of way of doing it. But I think hopefully the better we can help to raise awareness of, hey, this is a small group of people with limited time and money trying to make something cool. And maybe the more people understand that, maybe some of these things can be a little better, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always pro informing, you know, the uninformed, let's say.
Yeah.
Right? People that perhaps are curious and want to know a bit more. And that's I think that's why we've both started these channels, right? It's why I did Game Dev Guide, because ultimately, I did it for myself. But I think that you know, like anything, once you release a product, your audience then tells you what the product actually is, right?
And I think that's a great theme there too, actually.
Yeah. What I've come down to is that, like, I'm creating stuff that I talk about scaling things and just lessons I've learned in working on Living the Deal, because most of the videos I've made have come from tools or systems or scalable solutions to problems that I found while I'm working on that game. It's also why I don't make videos every week, because I wouldn't be able to work on the game, you know? And create these topics in the way and talk about them with the, I guess, like, confidence that I can, right? Because it's just like, no, this is how I've solved this thing, or this is the solution that I found to this problem I was having and why I don't like this thing, you know? And I think that show you're working kind of approach, because there are a lot of people that are doing devlogs that are just talking about, and I'm doing it for Living the Deal on, you know, Skitanic Studios channel, which is just talking about, like, things I'm dealing with and the ways that I've solved it. But the developer sort of focus side is definitely more the show you're working, which is like, here's the problem I was having, here's why I've gone with this solution, but this is also why it's a very specific solution for me, you know? And I think, like, showing that off is really important, because, again, going back to circling really far back, is that there's never one way to solve something.
Yeah.
It's just a case of, like, this is the thing that I think is going to help me the best get the game shipped.
Yeah, I hope that people can understand that and take it in that spirit of, you know, neither of us are kind of professors teaching a computer science course. This is stuff that's coming. This is coming out of the lived experience of trying to make something and saying, hey, this is what I found and this is what worked for me. And I think that's one of the reasons that people find it interesting and valuable. But I think it's important to remind people, like, look, you know, we're just figuring this stuff out too, you know?
Yeah, well, I mean, look, we've had tons of conversations where you've been like, I'm going to try this thing. And I'm like, I tried that thing. I didn't like it. Good luck.
Yeah.
And I'll just let you toy around with it, because it's like, you know, and talking about the scriptable object stuff earlier, you found different solutions that I'm not a fan of, but it doesn't mean you're wrong.
No.
You know?
And that's key.
It's like, it just works for you.
Yeah. No, I think that's really important, and I think that the process is a deeply individual one, right? Like, what one person likes or finds to be good is going to be very unique. And
I think like you said before, I think, like, ultimately most of the developer community really just care if your game is getting made. You know, if I meet a new developer and we're talking about games, the first question is just, how's it going? You know, or like. You know, how close are you, you know, where are you at in the stage, you know?
Yeah.
And we're more just interested in, like, how close are you to shipping? Because it's like, you've done it, you know? It's that, like, we're waiting for that moment where you're just like, well done, you did it, you know?
Totally.
Like you said, that shared empathy of, like, being excited for somebody else to finish a thing, you know?
Totally. Well, I think, speaking of finishing, I think that's a great place for us to wrap things up. So I just want to say a big thanks for doing this. I always enjoy our conversations, and I think it's really cool to give folks a chance to listen in. Hopefully, folks find it interesting. I just started putting my mouse. Started putting my mouse over my face. It's like in the screencast. Professional broadcasting. But
we didn't diverge too much. We sort of went all over the place.
I think it's good. It's long. You know, people can put it on in the background. Yeah. I think it's cool. I mean, that's the thing I like about this, as opposed to like a 10-minute video or something, is like you can kind of drift over here and then come back. And I think it's cool. I like it. So.
Yeah.
Go figure, right?
Well, yeah, hopefully it's helped. I think that's the big thing, you know, is that, you're right. Like, there's a lot I can't talk about in my 10-minute videos that I would easily be able to talk about here, you know. So thank you for having me on. And it's been fun.
Definitely. So don't forget to check out Game Dev Guide. Make sure you go watch those videos, subscribe, check out Living the Deal. You can follow both of us on Twitter. We put our usernames on the screen. If you're enjoying the content here on the Thousand Ant channel, please consider subscribing, drop a like on the video, leave us a comment down below if you want to see more of these long talking shows, or let us know if this is too long and too boring. We want to hear that as well. That's good feedback. So yeah, thanks again, Matt, and I'll see you soon.
Cheers.
All right, bye.
Bye.